we are looking at First Corinthians chapter 7. Whoops, I got the wrong page up right now. That's for a little bit later. First Corinthians chapter 7. And again, from the book that I've been taking a lot of quotes from. After his plea for unity in chapters 1 through 4 and his discussion of moral problems in chapters 5 through 6, Paul proceeds in the third portion of his letter, chapters 7 through 10, to answer some questions submitted to him by the Corinthians. So it's kind of like a little stump the pastor little session here. The questions dealt with the application of Christian freedom. In chapter 7, the apostle dwells on matters pertaining to the question whether or not to marry. His advice represents indirect counseling since he leaves it to the individual to decide the question on the basis of the Word of God, his or her own ability or inability to cope with sexual desires, and the unsettled conditions prevailing in the Roman Empire. And the first section is entitled, "It is good not to marry if," and you may know this section. The first verse in the ESV says, "Now concerning this matters of which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Does anyone have the NIV translation?
Yeah, it says not to have sexual relations with women.
Well, that's I think that's the same as the ESV. Is there anyone that says it is good for a man not to marry?
I do, the NIV, yes.
The NIV says it is good for a man not to marry?
Right, correct.
Right. Okay. So it is good for a man not to marry. Starting it off that way. Now, there is a man by the name of Mark Gungor, and he does a marriage seminar, a Christian marriage seminar. It's not necessarily supposed to be only for Christians, though, but obviously he is a pastor, not a Lutheran pastor. He is a pastor, actually in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Can you hear this?
If you're not much of a churchgoer, don't let that make you nervous. Some of my biggest fans are heathens. All right? And this isn't one of those things where we sneak you in and then beat you over the head with a Bible. All right? But I do have a Bible verse I need to show you, okay? Because I found a Bible verse that if you followed the advice from this one Bible verse, you will never, ever, ever have a problem in marriage. How many think that's worth seeing? All right, you follow the advice from this one verse, you'll never have a problem in marriage.
For a man not to marry.
It says it's good for a man not to marry. All right? So, well, now why would he say that? That's such a terrible thing to say. Because he goes on to explain, he who marries will have trouble in this life. You know, people come up to me, Pastor Mark, something's wrong. I say, what is it? We got trouble in our marriage. I go, no, that's about right. Hey, there ain't nothing wrong. That's pretty normal. Now, you don't hear these verses read at weddings very often. Kind of downplay that. You know? You don't see those on Hallmark cards. You don't see them on cakes with pretty calligraphy. He who marries will have trouble. But it's too late for you. Yes. You say, if that's the case, then why get married? Because marriage is absolutely wonderful. It's great. It's fantastic. but it's not that it's without trouble. All right? And I want to show one other verse to you. Now, you don't have the deep theological training that I have, so you might have a hard time understanding this verse, but I'll try and explain it to you. This is found in Proverbs, and it goes like this. Where no oxen are, the manger is clean. Let me explain that to you, okay? What does that mean? What it means, if you're gonna have an ox, you're going to have ox poo, all right? Now, if you don't like poo, and most of us are not real big fans of poo, if you don't like poo, the temptation is get rid of the ox. Preach it, brother. No. I don't want you to get rid of the ox, all right? You know? So, well, why would you keep the ox around? Because he goes to the second half of the verse, it says, because much increase comes by the strength of the ox. Well, now there's the catch-22. On the one hand, we all love the benefit of the ox, but nobody likes the poo. And what he's trying to tell us here is you cannot have one without the other. There is no such thing as a poo-free marriage. It just doesn't exist. Unless you shoot the ox, okay? But that leads to other problems. So this weekend is not about attaining a state of perfection in your life, all right? It's about getting a proper positive to poo ratio in your life. You see, because if all you get is poo, then you got one sick ox. Are you hearing me? All right? So, but there's no such thing as a poo-free marriage. For those of you having a hard time grasping this, I have a mathematical version of it. It goes, ox equals poo over positive. Some say positive over poo. But anyway, it's the ratio that we want to get going here, okay? Now.
All right. So anyway, I wanted to share that so that we are a little clear. I've mentioned this in Bible class before, but I thought what better way than to have Mark Gungor actually say it his own way. You know, there is no such thing as a poo-free marriage. So when it says it is not good for a man not to marry, he's not saying don't get married at all costs. It's against God's will to marry. That's not at all what he's trying to say. The apostle is writing here. It says what the apostle writes here must be read in light of the chaotic conditions, social customs, and pagan background of the early Christian era. Paul distinguishes between the word of God, which is permanent, and his counsel, which is contingent on circumstances. Note that this chapter does not contain all of Paul's teaching on marriage and related subjects. What was going on at the time? I mean, this is the beginnings of persecution of Christians and all that other kind of stuff. That going on along with the pressures from the pagan era of the, you know, the people's lives in the Corinthian church and everything else. He's saying with all that going on, it might be good for some of you not to marry. Okay? He's not saying don't get married. He's just saying think about all that's going on. This might not be the time for you to get married. You know? So let's read a little bit of scripture and then let's read 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 9 and see if we can get a better picture of what's being said here. Someone please read.
Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another.
More verses.
Did you, one more verse?
Two more.
To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Okay. So Paul advises the Corinthian Christians not to marry. Consider the advice Paul gives younger widows in 1 Timothy 5, verse 14. Let me read that real quickly. So I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. How does this verse help you understand more fully Paul's overall attitude toward marriage? Well, for one, he's not speaking actually against marriage, is he? He's just saying, you people in Corinth, with what you are dealing with right now, it might not be bad for you to hold off getting married right now. However, if you're going to get married, do it this way. That makes sense? Even though Paul says it would be sensible for Corinthians to remain unmarried for the time, Paul recommends marriage in 1 Corinthians 7:2. Think about what Paul says in that verse and also in verse 5. What awareness of human nature is Paul revealing in these verses?
First Corinthians.
Okay, here it is. 7 and
Temptation of the flesh.
Yeah, temptation of the flesh. Exactly. He's aware of this, and this is even from a person who wasn't married himself. You know, he knows what the temptations are, and because he's a human being, and he's saying, if you can't, control it, go ahead and get married, so that you don't give in to temptations. Reading verses 3 through 6, what understanding about the nature of marriage relationship is stated in this passage?
repeat the question again.
Reading verses 3 through 6, what understanding about the nature of the marriage relationship is stated in this passage?
Well, they should have a mutually fulfilling sexual relationship with each other.
Right, and that once you're married, you are not, your body isn't just yours, and vice versa. You're no longer two, but you're one.
Mhm.
In verses 8 through 9, Paul repeats his counsel that the Corinthians who are unmarried remain in that situation, However, he acknowledges that some couples may be better off getting married. Describe a situation today in which you would agree, though perhaps with misgivings, that a couple should marry despite practical disadvantages. Well, I think of a couple that maybe is not yet financially stable. I remember my sister-in-law before she got married, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but the first time, her fiance's parents were like not really wanting, they didn't want them to get married until they were both, you know, so financially stable that they had, you know, I don't know, so much money in the bank and all this other kind of stuff. And I thought, well, that might never happen. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and if they're concerned about falling into temptation and you know, and those kinds of things, it would be good for them to get married. Can you think of any other kind of a situation where it might not be practical to get married, but I've heard many stories of people during World War II
Yes,
that
during the
they got
wars.
married. They got married right before the husband got shipped off quickly.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not very practical, and yet they kind of looked at it like, if we don't get married, we may not get a chance to get married, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've also heard of somebody that got recently that was dying
Mm.
and got married right out of high school so that they could have a few months together before the husband died, I think.
Hmm.
Which is kind of a sad thing, but you know. Anything more on 1 through 9?
Well, I think today it's so common that they have kids and they're not married or don't have any intentions, you know, and of
That would
getting,
be, that would also possibly be a time when you say, you know what, why don't you do the right thing and get married?
yeah.
You know, for the sake of the kids. Mhm. You know, going back to Mark Gunger's thing, I really like that. You know, the one Bible verse that if you follow it to a T, you won't have problems in marriage. Don't get married. Well, yeah, you're not going to have any problems in marriage if you don't get married.
Yeah.
But you also don't have the benefits of being married either. The positive things.
Mhm.
All right. 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 16. Someone wants to read that.
To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. You want to go to the end of the chapter?
To the end of the little section, to 16.
To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Or how do you show, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
Yeah, okay, so it's talking against divorce, you know, because that's not the point of marriage. Paul now speaks to those who are already married, giving what he knows is a command from the Lord, not merely his own counsel. And that command is that people are to marry for life. Paul allows, however, for the possibility that a Christian might separate from her or his spouse. If a Christian does separate or divorce, Paul calls for that person to remain single, or if possible, to be reconciled to the separated spouse. In your opinion, what reasoning lies behind this direction?
Because during marriage, to become one.
Mhm. And God ultimately hates divorce. Now that, you know, but then he does talk about a possible reason for divorce, as does Jesus, you know, and we talk about the two biblical reasons for divorce are you know, marital unfaithfulness or malicious desertion, which is talked about here. And why are those acceptable? Because it's the other person who has already destroyed the marriage or damaged it, you know. He does still talk about possibly trying to reconcile, but the point is that they're really the ones that are divorcing, even if you're the one that actually goes through the paperwork. If that makes any sense.
No, lots of sense.
What's that?
What I said, it makes 100% sense for those of us that have been in that position. Once that person has deserted you, there's a reason why they've deserted you, and oftentimes it's another person involved. And
Right.
More than likely, once that person has decided they want divorce, they're not going to change their minds very often.
Right.
Although I remember during the time when I was divorced, I had a girlfriend who was Baptist, and she had been divorced for quite some time, and her husband had remarried, had children, but her pastor kept telling her, he's going to come back to you. He's going to come back to you. And I go, there's no way, you know, why should she have to live a life of loneliness while he has moved on with his life?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I also believe, and I don't believe that I am putting myself into this, but I will say that I do feel like I'm starting to go on the you know, away from the tree side of the branch that I'm sawing on here, but I do believe that it is possible to maliciously desert somebody and still be in the same place. In other words,
Yeah.
to be in the same household and abuse your spouse physically and emotionally, where you're still physically present, but you have abandoned the marriage.
Yes.
You have maliciously abandoned the marriage. And
Yes.
um,
Well, a perfect example of that would be someone who has to get divorced because if they stay, he'll kill them. He'll kill them.
right.
It's just that simple. And I like the way Jesus answers the question of marriage when they ask him, well, why did God allow divorce with Moses? And he said, because of your hardness of heart. And that is really the underlying reason for most divorces. It's because of your hardness of heart, your selfishness or whatever it happens to be. And so it has, God allows it for that. It's sin causes that.
Right.
And it's, you know, and he points that out, that it's, you know, it's not God's will that this happens.
Right.
It's you. But
But
yet God stands where you stand, you know?
But there could be situations like a Christian couple that have always attended church and everything, get married, and then one of them decides, no, he doesn't want anything to do with it, and like the kids or anything. And then that's a difficult situation. And we talked about that in another Bible class, where when we see couples are having issues, we need to maybe approach them, you know, or something, people that are having issues that are
Uh-huh.
visible.
Right. But sometimes they're not visible. And
Right.
that's part of the thing is that you might say, well, you know, they seem like everything's fine. And then all of a sudden they got a divorce. Well,
Mhm.
things might not be fine, you know. God intended that marriage fulfill several purposes. What do the following passages say about the purposes of marriage? Well, one is from our section here, 3 to 4. Let's see here. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And then 128 of Genesis. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then Genesis 2:18. Then the Lord said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. So what do they say about the purposes of marriage?
Well, the first one, obviously, they're talking about having children.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is we're to be helpmates to each other.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about man being a helper, having a helper for him, but it works both directions.
Right. There were 3 passages, so I would say sexual fulfillment within a committed, loving, and self-giving relationship, providing a nurturing climate in which children may be born and brought up, and companionship and help throughout life.
Mhm. What do you say to a couple like Adam and Jess that have lost both babies? You know, what do you know, how who would be wonderful, loving parents, but have not been given that opportunity? I know it's a struggle for our family, and I was visiting Jess's parents a couple weeks ago, and we discussed that too. And there doesn't seem to be a good answer for that.
Well, marriage is to be that, like I said, to provide a home for, the nurturing of children. And unfortunately, because of sin being in the world, we have, such thing as disease and other things that cause disease and death in the world. And so unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way. My counsel to them, obviously, I have no connection to them except through you. And so I would never say these things to them directly unless there was a longer time of trust and conversation built up over many years as their pastor. But in a short answer for what you're asking me right now, perhaps they're being, in a sense, they can still be parents in a different way. If the doctors and doctors indicate that they shouldn't continue trying that way to be parents by birth, maybe they can look into adoption or some other form. I think of the Earhard's son. They've been wanting to be parents for years, and in the last couple of years, they switched gears and went to adoption, and they have a beautiful little girl that they adopted. I have some friends that they had their first child while we were in seminary together, and then they had several miscarriages, and they tried different fertility methods and such, and then they made the decision to go into adoption, and then they adopted a little special needs girl through Love Basket from India. And they were assigned this child, and special needs. She had very short arms. Her hands were up here by her shoulders. And they had her name, they had her picture, they prayed for her and everything else. And then before they could go and pick her up, she died. Carla and I were references for them for the adoption. And so we knew all this stuff, and we were praying with them and everything else. And then the child died. And the company that was doing the adoption said, in all our years of adopting kids out, we never had one die after they'd been assigned to a family. And so they said, take your time to grieve, and you're on the top of our list when you're ready, when and if you're ready. And so they took some time and they grieved, and then they went through the process again, and they adopted another little girl, and they went over there and got her, and she's got some deformities of her hands, but she's not different special needs. But they adopted her, and then they came home, and the wife got pregnant. They brought the daughter home, and then the wife got pregnant, and then they had another son, and then went through the process again and adopted another little girl from India, and she ends up having like the same birthday as the boy that was born after the first one was adopted. And then she got pregnant again, and so they have 5 children from two different countries, and it's a totally different. And I marveled at it with him one time, and he says that just shows that I don't even have control over my own procreation. You know, how the Lord is going to bless this is how the Lord's going to bless us. You know, and I know, having gone through all that your son and daughter-in-law have gone through, you know, like I said, I would never, you know, meet them and say, hey, have you ever thought of adoption? I mean, that would hurt. I would
Don't
think.
even ask that question.
Huh?
I don't even ask that question because I
Um,
wouldn't hurt them. Yeah.
But I think, you know, they may get to that point,
Mhm.
and maybe they won't. I don't know. And I don't know what the doctors are saying to them as far as the likelihood or whether it's dangerous or you know, those kinds of things, because those all things have to go into consideration as well. I also know of a family at my first congregation, the Roses, and when I got there, Mr. Rose had passed away years before, but Mrs. Rose, Ruth Rose, was a member, and you know, in her 80s or something like that. And then she had a daughter named Sharon, and she had married a man named Lee Murray, so she was Sharon Murray, and then Dwayne Rose was a teacher. And after being there for a few weeks, I figured out that Dwayne Rose was Sharon Murray's brother. But I noticed there was a definite age gap, because I think Dwayne was in his upper 30s or low 40s, and I don't remember. I think Sharon was 18 years older or whatever. 20 years older or something like that. And I said something to him, and he goes, yeah. And he says, and apparently there were 18 confirmed miscarriages between
Oh my
Sharon
goodness.
and Dwayne.
Gee, well,
Oh my
And I looked at
goodness.
Dwayne and I said, man, are you a miracle?
Oh,
Because I don't know any couple that would have continued after 18
Mhm.
miscarriages.
Mhm.
I certainly wouldn't. It would have hurt too bad. I mean, it would have been so painful.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question.
I don't know if there's a good answer to the question, but that your answer was as good as any I've heard. So thank you.
Yeah. In 17 through 24, if someone would please read.
Nevertheless, each one should excuse me. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the station from which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man as responsible to God should remain in the situation God called him to. And did you say, is that all?
Yeah, that was,
Okay.
yes, yes. Paul refers to circumcision. Circumcision was commanded for Jews in the Old Testament as a sign of the covenant God had made with them to bring the Savior into the world through them. Explain why Paul says that someone who insists on being circumcised for spiritual reasons has fallen away from grace.
That's the first time I've heard that was commanded for the Jews as a sign of their covenant with God.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that was the whole thing, that you know, Jews had to be circumcised as
Mhm.
part of the covenant. And there were those at Paul's time then who were saying to the Gentiles, you had to become a Jew first and you become circumcised just to, you know, before you can become a Christian, you had to become a Jew first. And you know, they're missing the point. They're putting all the emphasis on the circumcision as opposed to on you know, the commands of God. So let's see here. Gentile Christians as well as Jews are saved through faith in Jesus Christ, who fulfilled the Old Testament ceremonial law and thus abolished it. Gentile Christians who allow themselves to be forced into circumcision are removing themselves from God's grace as their all-sufficient way of salvation and are placing themselves under the obligation to keep the entire ceremonial law. So the point is that these things were pointing to Christ. Christ fulfilled all these things, and so therefore those are unnecessary now for a Christian. And so if you're saying, well, I have to become circumcised before I can, you know, and become a Jew before I can become a Christian, you're pointing to the law as a salvation as opposed to the gospel, which is Jesus, who fulfilled all righteousness for us. Does that make sense? That's why he's saying, you know, you should stay the way you are. Don't go back into the law, kind of thing. We're in the gospel now. We're talking about the gospel stuff, and that's the way. Not saying that it's wrong to be circumcised, but to do it as a way to fulfill righteousness, you know, and to be saved. You know, like I got to be circumcised in order to be saved. Well, no. In order to be saved, you're saved by faith, not by works. Okay, Paul's counsel to slaves does not mean that Paul or the Lord approved of slavery itself. I don't know if you've ever heard this, where people say, well, there's slavery in the Bible and it doesn't look like, you know, God's really against it. No, that's not true. Note what Paul says to slaves who have an opportunity to gain their freedom in verses 21 to 23. He says, if you have an opportunity to become a freed person, do it. But what he's saying about, you know, if you're a slave, remain a slave, he's not saying because it's a good thing to be a slave. He's saying, don't just, you know, like break the law in order to, you know, because you don't need to be a slave anymore or whatever. Don't run away from your master just because you know, now you're a Christian or something like that. That's kind of going opposite of what God would want you to do. What assessment of slavery do you find revealed in this passage? This person says, Paul regarded slavery as contrary to the peace that God has brought about through Christ's work. Human slavery is totally at odds with God's view of human beings. So don't let anybody tell you that God is okay with slavery just because there were slaves in the Bible.
And then going back to that you had to be, where was it? To be circumcised to be a Jew. Well, then what about the women? What did they have to do? They just were considered Jewish because they were married to a man, or?
Yeah, married to a man and born to Jewish parents.
Okay,
You have to understand that circumcision is a sign of the coming Messiah. Who, Jesus Christ, was he a woman? No, he was a man. So it's a sign that they will have a male will come forward and save the world from sins. So it's not, the circumcision is not something like, it's going to earn you anything into heaven. It's a sign, just like any other, like the sacrifices that they did for an atonement, to atone people's for their sins. The whole Passover meal, everything, that's all a sign of the coming of the Messiah. Does that mean we have to do it? No, we don't have to do it, because they're signs that shows the coming of the Messiah. Circumcision is a sign. It doesn't matter anymore. What Paul's saying, it doesn't matter.
okay, did they do the circumcision in church or in a service, or?
Ceremony is
It was a ceremony and done 8 days after
Oh, yeah, okay,
the baby was born.
right,
And at Jesus' time, they did that at the temple.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. So it is 11 o'clock. And so we've got a little bit more to go here. So we'll start here. I'm going to put a little mark on here. This is where we'll start next week. And then we'll go on to chapter 8 probably next week as well. But I don't want to take up more of your day. But this was a good discussion. Got a lot of stuff in here. And this one, some of the other chapters so far have had only like 16 verses, and this one has 40. So, it's a little bit more in depth. So it kind of takes up 2 lessons, I would say. Anything else for the good of the cause? All right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Well, it was good seeing everyone,
Yeah,
Same here.
and look forward to a little more of this next week.
now we can get back to church in person. The more people that get their shots.
Yeah. Well, I had 48 bulletins laid out on pews, and we had 44 people in the late service. So that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Approximately 30, maybe 40 on the live stream. So we didn't do too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I have many friends that were quite envious of the fact I got to attend church on Easter Sunday. So it's interesting how things are changing throughout the United States here.
Yeah.
And we are somewhat progressive, but I've been reading also on the Lutheran confessional website or their Facebook page. Some churches are talking about they're already going to just regular church service, no masks, even using common cup at communion.
Yeah. I don't know if we're ready for that.
Right. It was wonderful how you did Communion Sunday, how with
Yeah.
Vicar helping you, that.
Oh, yeah, the field worker, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm gonna be talking to the elders tomorrow night. And we may modify it some more. Because by the next time we go to communion, I will be fully vaccinated and fully, 2 weeks after. And so we may just use the communion rails, start using the communion rails again. I don't know if we're ready to go back to common cup, but
Yeah.
but I don't see it being too much longer. I mean, even the guy that the very conservative people don't like Dr. Fauci said, if the trajectory keeps going the way it looks like, he says, it may be safe to be maskless by Memorial Day. So I don't know. And it may depend on where you are. St. Louis County said that we should be at herd immunity with the vaccine by June 20th. So we shall see.
Thing that almost half of the people who are coming up positive are in like 4 states. They're in like New York, California, I think Vermont, some other place. They're like 4 states take up 47%. People are starting to test positive.
Florida and Texas still have a lot of positives.
Yes, I have a friend that was diagnosed in Florida yesterday, day before with COVID. Yeah, so it's still alive and well, and maybe it's good we all hear those reminders that people are still getting sick so that we don't just stop being cautious. Yeah.
Right.
It's,
Mhm.
yeah, don't get overconfident and drive
Right.
yourself right back into it again.
Mhm.
All righty.
Okay, well, thanks.
When you
Yep.
want the trailer, just
Bye.
call.
Bye,
All right, I'll give you
everybody.
a call. All
Bye.
right, take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.